We don't give presidential suites to people like you." Jack Thompson's voice sliced through the air, loud and sharp enough that the soft piano music in the Grandview Hotel lobby seemed to falter mid-note, like even the melody recoiled at the cruelty embedded in those words. Walter Price, 70 years old, stood frozen, not because he didn't understand what was being said, but because he understood it too well. He had heard that phrase or its 1,000 variations across 7 decades, in bank offices, at grocery store counters, in classrooms, in quiet glances and cold dismissals. But this was different. It was public, deliberate, amplified by the polished marble floors and high ceilings that made every insult echo longer than it should. Around them, a dozen guests paused in their quiet conversations. Cocktails suspended mid-air, leather shoes halted mid-stride, curious eyes darting toward the spectacle at the front desk, where a white man in a crisp navy suit was pointing at an old black man in worn loafers and a neatly pressed but modest linen shirt, his posture dignified but his shoulders heavy with a lifetime of quiet endurance. Standing just beside Walter was his daughter, Savannah Price, 43 years old. A woman whose very bearing radiated authority in subtle ways. The precise cut of her dark blazer, the unflappable calm of her expression, the polished restraint in her voice as she gently placed a hand on her father's forearm. A gesture both tender and grounding, as if she were saying without words that she saw his pain, but would not let this moment define him or break them. Savannah's eyes did not waver as she turned toward Jack Thompson, her gaze steady and almost serene, as if she had seen this precise scene before in another form, another era, in history books and family stories and late-night kitchen conversations where resilience had been taught as both necessity and inheritance. But what made this moment distinct was that Jack Thompson had no idea who he was speaking to, and therein lay the hinge on which this entire story would soon turn. The lobby, grand in every architectural sense, with chandeliers that sparkled like frozen stars and a subtle perfume of orchids and aged mahogany, became smaller somehow, heavier with the collective silence of those witnessing a confrontation they would rather not acknowledge, but could no longer ignore. Jack's words, delivered with the smug confidence of a man who believed his assumptions to be policy, were meant to wound and dismiss at once, and though Walter Price stood straight back, his hands remained still at his sides, a slight tremor visible only to his daughter, who knew that tremor, not as weakness, but as memory of standing quietly when dignity was denied. Savannah did not respond with outrage, though outrage swelled beneath her calm exterior like a wave held at bay. Instead, she leaned in slightly and said quietly to her father, "Let's step outside for a moment, Daddy." Her voice a balm over the raw sting of humiliation, her tone deliberate and composed in a way that drew its own kind of power because it did not match the chaos Jack Thompson had tried to provoke. As they turned, a murmur rippled through the bystanders, some lowering their heads, others pretending sudden distraction by their phones or the check-in counter brochures, but all aware that they had just witnessed something wrong, something deeply uncomfortable, and yet none moved to intervene or even to offer a glance of solidarity. Walter's steps were slow as he followed his daughter toward the glass doors, his gaze lowered not in shame but in weary calculation, aware that this moment was neither unique nor surprising, but that his daughter's stillness suggested an ending he had never imagined in the many years he had endured such slights. Outside, the streets of Manhattan buzzed with their usual clamor. Horns, footsteps, the distant wail of an ambulance siren, life continuing indifferently, as if a small fracture in human dignity had not just occurred behind the glass facade of the Grandview Hotel, but, for Savannah Price, the world had narrowed to this singular intersection of disrespect and history, and she moved with the calm focus of a woman who knew that power did not need to announce itself loudly to be effective. As she reached into her structured leather handbag and pulled out her phone, her fingers moved with a precision that betrayed no trembling, dialing numbers from memory, numbers belonging to the people who mattered when quiet accountability was required. Her personal counsel, her chief of human resources, her trusted assistant Jordan Matthews, each call brief, clipped, clear in purpose. Her words were few but devastatingly effective. Jordan, prepare the files on Grandview staff immediately. I'll be back in less than 30 minutes. A statement uttered not with bravado but with certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from knowing exactly where true authority resides. Walter Price stood beside her, watching as his daughter orchestrated what was to come, and though he said nothing, the set of his jaw softened slightly, his eyes reflecting not just the city lights, but a glimmer of pride, tempered by decades of hard-earned restraint. Inside the hotel lobby, Jack Thompson straightened his tie and turned back toward the front desk with a smirk curling at the corner of his lips, unaware that the brief victory he thought he had secured would unravel faster than he could adjust his expensive cufflinks. And so the stage was set, the air thick with the charged quiet that precedes a storm unlike any the Grandview Hotel had seen. A reckoning that would arrive not with fury, but with flawless precision, not with loud demands, but with quiet, surgical inevitability. And in that brief interlude between insult and consequence, Savannah Price allowed herself a single breath, steadying not her anger, but her resolve. She had no intention of walking away quietly. The Grandview Hotel had always prided itself on its reputation, a sanctuary for the wealthy, a monument to polished excess and curated luxury, a place where even the scent of the orchids carefully arranged at the concierge desk spoke of money that had been old for so long it no longer needed to introduce itself. Its marble floors gleamed under the filtered afternoon light, polished to such a perfection that guests often caught glimpses of themselves and for a brief moment believed they belonged to a more refined version of their own lives. The ceilings rose impossibly high, framing chandeliers that sparkled as if their sole purpose was to cast light only on those deemed worthy. Every inch of the lobby whispered the same message. Appearance mattered, assumptions ruled, and deviation from expectation would not go unnoticed. It was into this cultivated stillness that Savannah Price had stepped just minutes before, not as an intruder, but as someone who had earned the right to belong, though the staff at the front desk had not even looked up long enough to recognize it. She was a woman who moved through the world with precision, every detail of her appearance a quiet declaration of success, hard-won and maintained without apology. The perfectly tailored black blazer that hugged her shoulders with subtle strength, the cream silk blouse beneath, soft but impeccably pressed, the dark slacks that fell in clean lines to polished leather heels that neither clacked nor faltered as she walked, and around her wrist, a slim platinum watch with a face small enough to suggest discretion but bold enough to remind anyone who noticed that her time was both valuable and carefully measured. Her hair, pulled back into a low, elegant twist, revealed a face composed not of rigid self-control but of practiced serenity. A kind of calm that came from years of knowing that dignity was often the most disarming weapon. But for all her presence, Savannah had not walked into the Grandview Hotel alone. By her side, Walter Price had moved with slower steps but no less grace, his frame slightly stooped by time but his posture stubbornly straight, the posture of a man who had worked for everything he possessed and had accepted long ago that some doors would never open for him, no matter how hard he had tried to prove himself worthy. Walter's life had been one of quiet perseverance. A schoolteacher for nearly 40 years in New Jersey's inner-city schools, a man who had stayed late to tutor children whose parents worked double shifts, a man who had returned home each evening to correct papers by hand under the glow of a single desk lamp, because that was the only way he knew to prepare his students for a world that would not care about their struggles. He had spent his youth cleaning the lobbies of places much like the Grandview Hotel, sweeping marble floors he would never be invited to walk across as a guest, polishing brass handles on doors he would never enter except as an invisible custodian. And now, decades later, his daughter had booked the presidential suite of this very hotel for him, a gesture not of indulgence but of gratitude, a way of saying that his sacrifices had not gone unnoticed, that the quiet hours he had spent teaching and working and providing had built not just a family, but a legacy. Savannah had chosen the Grandview precisely because of what it represented, a place that had excluded men like her father for generations, but that now, through her own success, was open to them. Or so she thought. What Savannah could not have anticipated was that despite her title, her status, and her ownership stake in the chain of hotels that included the Grandview, the staff at this location would look first at her skin and her father's, then decide they did not belong. It was not ignorance, it was reflex, a quiet dismissal cloaked in polite indifference until Jack Thompson had stripped even that thin veneer away with his careless cruelty. For Savannah, this was not merely about a reservation gone wrong. This was about something deeper, something that resonated through the polished air of that lobby and into the marrow of her bones. A reminder that no matter how high she rose, how much she accomplished, how many millions she earned, there would still be moments when someone with less power but more arrogance would try to reduce her to people like you. And it was about Walter Price, who had endured far too many such moments in his life and who deserved better, especially now. The Grandview Hotel itself, with its grand name carved in stone above the entrance, represented more than a building or a brand. It represented a history of exclusion, an unspoken rulebook of who deserved to be served and who did not, of who could move comfortably through its spaces and who would always be questioned, stalled, scrutinized, or ignored. The irony was bitter. Savannah Price did not merely belong at the Grandview, she effectively owned it, her portfolio containing an equity share that made her not just a guest, but a majority stakeholder. She had helped finance renovations, she had signed off on training protocols, she had approved floral budgets and executive appointments, all while maintaining an exacting standard for how hospitality should feel: seamless, gracious, generous. And yet, despite all that, the young front desk clerk, Rachel Simmons, had not even raised her eyes to meet Savannah's when she first approached the counter. And Jack Thompson had done far worse, daring to wield authority in a space that, unbeknownst to him, Savannah had built. As Walter stood beside his daughter outside the glass doors, watching the bustle of Manhattan swirl past them, his heart ached not for himself but for her, for the knowledge that she would have to fight battles he thought he had already fought on her behalf. But Savannah, standing straight and calm, had already decided that this would not end in retreat. She would not allow Grandview to remain a place where assumptions went unchallenged, where quiet dignity was met with loud disrespect. Inside that lobby the air had felt cool and perfumed, but outside, the late summer heat pressed against them like a reminder that the world was still moving, and Savannah Price, with her phone in hand and her resolve intact, was preparing to move with it. Not away from conflict, but straight toward it, carrying not just her father's dignity, but her own. When Savannah Price had first approached the front desk, she had waited the polite 5 seconds, then 10 before speaking, giving the young woman behind the counter every chance to acknowledge her presence, to lift her eyes from the tablet she studied, as if it held the secret to running a hotel. Rachel Simmons had not moved, not so much as a nod or glance, her fingers swiping absently while Savannah and Walter Price stood waiting. a small scene of studied indifference that was, in itself, an act of dismissal. Savannah's voice, when she finally spoke, was clear and warm. "Good afternoon. We have a reservation for the presidential suite under the name Savannah Price." No hesitation, no impatience, a tone honed over decades of navigating spaces that did not expect her, one that left no room for misunderstanding, yet offered every opportunity for respect. Rachel glanced up briefly, lips pressed together, her eyes sliding over Savannah and then Walter before returning to her screen without comment, her silence more pointed than any words she could have chosen. Then, without explanation, she rose from her chair and disappeared into the small office behind the counter, leaving Savannah and Walter standing alone in the grandeur of the Grandview lobby, as if they had interrupted something rather than simply arrived to claim what was rightfully theirs. Walter shifted slightly, the weight of the moment not unfamiliar but no less heavy for its predictability. Savannah met her father's gaze and offered a gentle smile, a private reassurance that this slight, too, would be handled. She was used to small indignities, but what followed was not small. Rachel returned a few minutes later, not alone this time, but trailed by Jack Thompson, the front office manager whose perfectly knotted tie and tailored suit could not conceal the sharpness in his expression. His eyes swept over Savannah and Walter with a quick, appraising glance, pausing just long enough to betray the conclusions he had already drawn. Jack did not introduce himself. He did not ask for clarification or apology. Instead, he leaned toward Rachel and asked, in a voice pitched just loud enough to be heard by those nearby, "They said they booked the presidential suite?" Rachel nodded, murmuring, "Yes, that's what she said." Jack straightened, squared his shoulders, and then turned directly toward Savannah. His smile thin and tight, his tone clipped and practiced, but laced with something colder. "We don't give presidential suites to people like you. I don't care what you think you paid for." It was a sentence delivered without hesitation, without concern for decorum or audience. A line spoken like a closing argument in a trial, where Savannah and Walter had already been found guilty of simply existing in a place someone like Jack Thompson believed they did not belong. The lobby, grand and airy just moments before, seemed to contract around them, the subtle hum of conversation falling away into an uncomfortable hush as guests nearby froze in place, their eyes darting toward the confrontation but their bodies motionless, unwilling to intervene, unwilling to make eye contact but unable to look away. Savannah remained still, the corners of her mouth tightening just slightly, her back straight and head high. Her silence was deliberate, her stillness precise, the measured response of a woman who understood that dignity was most visible when it was being threatened. Walter reached instinctively for her hand, a gesture that contained decades of history, a lifetime of lessons about when to speak and when to stand quietly, but even as his fingers found hers, he felt the steady pulse in her palm, a pulse that told him she was not withdrawing, she was calculating. "I'm sorry," Savannah said finally, her voice calm but clear, each word articulated with deliberate care. "What did you just say?" Jack Thompson did not blink, did not waver. "Your kind of reservation doesn't come through this hotel. If you'd like to speak to someone else, you're welcome to contact the corporate office." Behind him, Rachel Simmons stood frozen, her eyes darting between Jack and Savannah, her posture rigid, her hands trembling just enough that they clutched the edge of the counter for stability. Savannah inhaled slowly, grounding herself not in anger but in resolve, her gaze unwavering. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll step outside. But this isn't the end of it." And as she turned, leading Walter gently but firmly back through the same lobby they had entered with quiet confidence just moments earlier, the atmosphere inside the Grandview remained suspended, a stillness marked by the tension of something witnessed but not yet understood by those watching. Guests returned to their conversation slowly, cautiously, their voices hushed, their glances furtive. But the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air, a discomfort that settled into the polished surfaces and crystal chandeliers, into the very walls of the hotel that prided itself on discretion and luxury. Jack Thompson exhaled, adjusting his tie again as he watched them leave, a smirk returning to the corner of his lips, his mind already moving on to the next guest, unaware that the moment he had engineered so confidently would soon collapse upon him, that the woman he had dismissed with such ease was not merely another customer but the very force behind the Grandview's success. Outside, Savannah paused just beyond the revolving glass doors, the late afternoon sun warm against her face, the sounds of the city swirling around her, and though she did not speak immediately, Walter could feel the shift in her energy, not retreat, but readiness. She opened her purse and retrieved her phone, her fingers moving with a calm precision that belied the storm already forming behind her composed expression. "Jordan," she said quietly when the call connected, "I need a full report on the Grandview staff on duty today. I'm coming back in 25 minutes. Walter watched her, pride and pain mingling behind his tired eyes, and in that moment he understood that this was not simply about a sweet or a slight. This was about legacy. The legacy he had built, and the legacy Savannah was now defending, not with rage, but with a steady, unshakable grace that neither Jack Thompson nor anyone inside that lobby would ever have seen coming. Legacy was come. Savannah Price stood just outside the glass doors of the Grandview Hotel, the engraved brass nameplate gleaming behind her, as indifferent to the insult moments earlier as the marble floors inside. The city moved around her, horns blaring in the distance, a breeze rustling the sleeve of her blazer. But her focus was absolute. Narrowed down to the quiet precision of her next steps, she did not rush, did not pace, did not let even the smallest gesture betray the force gathering within her, a force not of anger but of clarity. Her father stood beside her, silent, his gaze directed not at her but at the hotel facade, his expression unreadable, but his posture telling. Walter Price had lived through too many moments like this to mistake Savannah's stillness for acquiescence. He recognized the rhythm of her breath, the steadiness of her fingers as she unlocked her phone, and he knew before she spoke that she was preparing not an outburst, but an answer. Savannah tapped the screen with unhurried confidence, her movements exact, dialing not just one number but 3 in succession. Her voice calm and succinct with each brief exchange. "Jordan, I need you in position with files on Grandview staff. David from legal should be ready to join me. And HR? Tell them this is not a review. It's a resolution." Each sentence was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority, and for a man like Walter Price, who had spent a lifetime navigating institutions where power always looked like someone else, watching his daughter exercise hers with such ease was both vindicating and deeply moving. But Savannah did not look at her father in that moment. Her eyes remained fixed on her phone, on the logistics, on assembling the people and tools she needed, not to punish, but to correct. Inside the Grandview Hotel lobby, Jack Thompson had resumed his position behind the front desk, leaning in to whisper something to Rachel Simmons, who forced a nervous smile, glancing toward the entrance every few seconds as if sensing that something had shifted. Other staff members moved about with forced casualness, rearranging brochures, adjusting flower arrangements, all trying to re-establish the rhythm that Savannah's exit had so clearly disrupted. But the lobby could not shake the unease now threaded through its atmosphere. Even guests who had tried to return to their conversations found themselves glancing toward the entrance, their curiosity piqued by the quiet dignity of Savannah's departure and by the unmistakable tension left behind. Savannah, meanwhile, turned slightly toward her father, her voice low but firm. "Daddy, wait for me here. This won't take long." Walter hesitated, the protective instincts of a father warring with the hard-earned respect he felt for the woman his daughter had become. After a moment he nodded, folding his arms slowly across his chest, not as a defensive gesture, but as one of patience, of trust. Savannah stepped toward the entrance, her heels clicking softly on the pavement, the sound measured and deliberate, and for a brief moment she paused just before the revolving door, glancing up at the Grandview's name engraved in stone. It was a name she had helped elevate, a brand she had built her reputation upon, but today it had betrayed her. Not because of the structure or the marble or the chandeliers, but because of the people inside who still failed to understand the very values the name was supposed to represent. When she entered the lobby again, 25 minutes after she had been so publicly dismissed, Savannah did not come alone. Behind her, Jordan Matthews walked swiftly, tablet in hand, crisp suit immaculate, every inch the competent right hand of a CEO who meant business. Flanking them was David Carter, corporate counsel, an older black man whose steady gaze and impeccable gray suit spoke of decades spent ensuring that power was exercised precisely and lawfully. The moment Savannah crossed the threshold, the energy in the lobby shifted. Conversations stopped entirely this time, not because of spectacle, but because of presence. The staff behind the front desk froze, Rachel's fingers hovering uncertainly above her keyboard, her eyes wide, her lips slightly parted, as if caught mid-sentence. Jack Thompson, still holding a clipboard, turned slowly, his posture stiffening when he recognized Savannah, this time accompanied not by an elderly man in casual clothes, but by a professional entourage, whose very appearance signaled that this was no longer a customer service issue but something far larger, far more consequential. Savannah did not rush. Her steps were unhurried, her expression serene, her gaze forward. When she reached the counter, she did not speak immediately. Instead, she paused, allowing the silence itself to become part of her statement. A silence so profound that even the soft background music piped through the hotel's speakers seemed to fade. Then, with a clarity that cut through the stillness, she spoke. "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Savannah Price. I am the founder and majority owner of the Grandview Hotel chain, including this property. I booked the presidential suite for my father under my name 2 weeks ago." Her words were not loud, but they carried, reaching every corner of the marble lobby, resonating not just because of their content, but because of their timing. A reclamation of space, of dignity, of authority. Behind her, Jordan Matthews stood ready, tablet illuminated, with staff files already prepared for review. David Carter said nothing, but his presence alone underscored the seriousness of the moment. Savannah continued, her voice unwavering. "This is Mr. David Carter, our general counsel. He's here to observe the next few minutes, which will determine the future of this hotel's management and staff practices. Jordan Matthews is here to facilitate an immediate review of records, protocol adherence, and conduct." Her eyes finally met Jack Thompson's, calm but unyielding. "And you, Mr. Thompson, will remain exactly where you are for this discussion." It was a simple statement, yet its authority left no room for misunderstanding. In that moment, Savannah Price had reclaimed not only the narrative, but the very space from which she and her father had been so summarily dismissed. The reckoning had begun. Not with raised voices or threats, but with deliberate, measured precision. And this time, Savannah Price would not be leaving. As Savannah Price stood at the front desk of the Grandview Hotel, her presence transformed the very air around her. The marble lobby, once so confident in its polished elegance, now felt exposed, stripped of the illusion that its luxury could excuse the small cruelties that had just unfolded within its walls. The ornate chandeliers still sparkled overhead, the orchids in their cut-glass vases still perfumed the air, and yet none of that could mask the shift taking place. A shift embodied in the woman who now stood silently but undeniably at its center. Jack Thompson, so certain of himself only moments ago, found his posture faltering. His clipboard, which had once seemed an extension of his authority, felt suddenly weightless and irrelevant in his hands. He swallowed, glanced sideways at Rachel Simmons, who sat stiff and pale behind the desk, then straightened his tie in a reflex that could no longer summon control. Savannah did not rush to speak. Her silence was deliberate. A silence that invited discomfort but offered no escape from it. The soft hum of guests whispering nearby had grown quieter still, replaced by a collective awareness that something significant was unfolding, something that went beyond a customer complaint or a service lapse. This was about power being reclaimed in real time. When she finally spoke, her voice was not raised, but its clarity commanded attention. "Let me make something very clear," Savannah began, her words measured, every syllable placed precisely where it needed to be. "I am Savannah Price. I am the founder and majority shareholder of Price Hospitality Group, which owns and operates the Grandview Hotel you stand in now." She let that fact sink in, allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for comprehension to replace shock in the faces of those listening, staff and guests alike. Rachel's fingers tightened involuntarily around the edge of the counter, her knuckles paling, while Jack Thompson's confident smirk evaporated entirely, replaced by something closer to dread. Savannah continued, her gaze never leaving Jack's. "This morning I arrived here with my father, Walter Price, a man who has worked for decades to make it possible for his daughter to stand in a place like this, not as a guest, but as an owner." She paused, her expression softening slightly but her tone firm. And yet he was treated as if his dignity could be appraised at a glance and found wanting. The lobby held its breath. Even the most distracted guest could no longer pretend not to watch, not to listen. A woman seated near the fireplace slowly set down her wine glass, her gaze fixed intently on Savannah, while another man across the room lowered his newspaper, no longer interested in shielding himself from the truth now being spoken aloud. Savannah gestured gently toward Jordan Matthews, who stood just behind her, tablet in hand, its screen aglow with staff records and timestamps. "This is Jordan Matthews, my executive assistant, here to assist in what comes next," she said. Then she inclined her head toward David Carter, standing to her left in his immaculate gray suit. "And this is David Carter, corporate counsel, present to ensure that every action I take today adheres to both policy and principle." Her words were not an introduction. They were a declaration, a reminder to all present that what was happening now was not a scene, not a spectacle, but an exercise of rightful authority. Savannah turned her attention fully to Jack Thompson, her voice lowering slightly, carrying the weight of disappointment and resolve. "You assumed I was just another woman whose presence here you could question, whose reservation you could disregard," she said quietly, almost gently, but her words struck sharper for their restraint. "You did not bother to ask who I was or why I was here. Instead, you chose to humiliate a guest, a man whose only crime was to stand beside me while being black and older and, in your view, not belonging." A ripple moved through the assembled onlookers, a kind of collective reckoning, as those words, so plain and undeniable, settled over them like a veil being lifted. Savannah let the silence speak again, her stillness more powerful than any raised voice. Behind the desk, Rachel Simmons tried to avert her gaze but found herself trapped in the moment, her hands trembling now, her face pale. Jack Thompson's breath had grown shallow, his usual practiced expressions of polite distance now replaced by the raw discomfort of a man who understood too late the gravity of his failure. Savannah took a final step forward, closing the small distance between herself and the counter, her hands resting lightly on its polished surface, reclaiming the space in a gesture at once simple and profound. "You didn't just make a mistake today," she said quietly, her gaze steady, her tone unflinching. "You made a decision to treat my father as less than, to treat me as invisible, and to violate every principle this brand is supposed to stand for." Her words, though soft, carried through the entire lobby, and there was no one left pretending not to listen now. Phones had begun to appear discreetly in hands, cameras raised without being asked. The moment already slipping beyond the polished confines of the Grandview Hotel and into the wider world where images traveled faster than apologies. But Savannah did not look at the cameras, did not perform for them. Her focus remained squarely on those before her, the people who had failed, the people who had chosen judgment over service, assumption over inquiry, disrespect over dignity. And as she spoke her next words, her voice remained calm, her expression almost serene, but there was no mistaking the finality in her tone. "From this moment forward," Savannah said, "everything about how this hotel operates, how this staff serves, how this brand upholds its values, will change." Then she stepped back, not as a retreat, but as an invitation to reckon with what would come next. In the wake of Savannah Price's measured declaration, a heavy silence enveloped the Grandview Hotel lobby, a silence that did not comfort, but exposed. The marble floors that once reflected confidence now seemed to reflect uncertainty. The staff, once composed in their practiced routines, now stood rigid, their eyes darting between Savannah and Jack Thompson, who had lost the false ease that had previously animated his gestures. His arms hung awkwardly at his sides, the clipboard he held earlier now resting uselessly on the counter as if even it could no longer lend him authority. Savannah remained where she was, not rushing to fill the silence, allowing it to deepen and force those present to confront what had transpired. Her gaze swept slowly over the front desk, pausing briefly on Rachel Simmons, whose pale face betrayed a cocktail of shame and fear. But Savannah did not speak to Rachel first. She turned her attention fully to Jack Thompson, her tone still quiet, yet now weighted with a clarity that allowed no misunderstanding. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice calm and deliberate, "you were entrusted with representing this hotel's values. Values that include dignity, respect, and inclusion. Tell me, at what point did you decide that these values did not apply to me and my father today?" Her question was rhetorical, but its effect was devastating. Jack opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. His throat worked visibly. The confidence that had once filled his posture now drained entirely. Savannah continued without pause, her voice still soft, almost gentle, but its edges honed with precision. "You made a decision," she repeated, "not an oversight, not a misunderstanding. A decision to look at my father and me, to weigh us not by our reservation or the names on the ledger, but by the assumptions you carried when you saw our faces." A ripple moved through the lobby again, guests now fully engaged, their casual conversations forgotten, their attention locked on every word spoken. A man near the concierge desk lowered his phone slowly, his face serious as he absorbed the moment not as a spectacle, but as a reckoning. Savannah did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her restraint itself carried power, the power of someone who had endured such moments before but was no longer willing to let them pass unchallenged. She turned briefly to Rachel Simmons then, her gaze steady but not unkind. "And you, Miss Simmons," she said gently. "You sat behind this desk while I waited patiently for acknowledgement. You looked past me, ignored me, chose silence when respect would have required speech. Why?" Rachel's lips parted, a shallow breath escaping, but like Jack, she found herself unable to summon words that could excuse what she had done, or failed to do. Savannah let the question hang for a beat longer, then continued, her tone softening almost imperceptibly but not diminishing in firmness. "It's easy to think that bias is loud, that it looks like shouting or slurs, but more often it looks like what happened here today. The refusal to see, the decision not to acknowledge, the subtle, practiced dismissal of a person's dignity before a single word is even exchanged." Her eyes moved across the room now, meeting the gaze of staff members who had watched from the sidelines, who had seen but had not intervened, whose silence had tacitly endorsed Jack's arrogance. "And let me say this clearly," she added, her voice now dropping slightly, each syllable deliberate. "When you look away, when you stay silent, when you allow one person's prejudice to dictate your actions or your inaction, you become complicit in their cruelty." Behind her, Jordan Matthews and David Carter stood ready, not as props, but as silent affirmations that Savannah's authority was not symbolic, that what she said next would carry immediate and lasting consequences. Savannah's gaze returned to Jack, whose face was now pale and taut, the lines of superiority erased and replaced by the dawning awareness that his tenure here had already ended, even if she had not yet spoken the words aloud. "You disrespected my father," Savannah said softly, her voice nearly a whisper but cutting sharper than any accusation. "You disrespected me, but more than that, you disrespected the very principles on which this hotel was founded, the principles that I, as majority owner, expect to be upheld in every interaction, at every level, with every guest." She stepped slightly closer to the counter then, her posture relaxed but commanding, and added, "Effective immediately, your employment at Grandview Hotel is terminated." The finality in her tone left no space for argument, no pretense of negotiation. Rachel Simmons inhaled sharply as if to speak, but Savannah turned her gaze toward her before she could find her voice. "Ms. Simmons," Savannah continued, her tone unchanged but her intent unmistakable, "you will also be leaving us today. Not because of a single mistake, but because of a pattern of behavior that I can no longer allow in this organization." Rachel's face flushed, then drained of color, her hands trembling as they fell to her lap. She said nothing, and in that silence Savannah found all the confirmation she needed. The lobby remained still, guests and staff alike frozen in the weight of what they had witnessed. Savannah exhaled slowly, a breath not of relief but of resolve, then spoke once more, this time to everyone present, her words intended to linger not just in the air but in memory. "Let today serve as a reminder," she said softly, "that respect is not optional, that dignity is not conditional, and that no one, not even those who believe themselves untouchable, may act with impunity when it comes to how they treat others." Then, without raising her voice, without allowing even a trace of triumph to color her expression, Savannah Price stepped back, not in retreat, but in graceful conclusion, leaving those she addressed no illusions about where authority truly resided. As Savannah Price delivered her final words, the lobby of the Grandview Hotel felt transformed, not in appearance, but in atmosphere. The chandeliers still shimmered above, the floral arrangements still stood perfectly manicured. But the air was heavier now, dense with a collective awareness that something profound had just occurred within these polished walls. Jack Thompson did not speak. His shoulders, once squared with the arrogance of unchecked authority, sagged slightly, as if the weight of Savannah's quiet precision had finally settled upon him. He turned, half expecting to find support in the faces of his staff, but Rachel Simmons sat silently, pale and still, her fingers trembling at the edge of the counter, no longer typing, no longer scrolling, simply existing in the stark clarity of consequence. Savannah inclined her head toward Jordan Matthews, whose expression remained calm but efficient. Without needing further instruction, Jordan stepped forward, tablet in hand, and slid 2 discreet envelopes onto the counter, one addressed to Jack Thompson, the other to Rachel Simmons. "Your termination packages," Jordan said gently, almost kindly, but his words held the same finality that Savannah's had moments earlier. "You'll be escorted to collect your belongings immediately. Security will accompany you off the premises within the hour." At the periphery of the lobby, a young bellhop, a Latino man who had watched the entire scene unfold without speaking, stepped forward quietly, a respectful nod to Savannah as he positioned himself near Jack and Rachel, ready to serve as silent witness and escort. His gesture was subtle but meaningful, a signal that respect had not been lost on everyone who worked within these walls. Across the lobby, guests sat in stillness, their earlier hesitation now replaced by curiosity and, in some, a quiet admiration. Several had begun recording discreetly, their phones raised not with spectacle in mind but with an instinct to document a reckoning that felt larger than a single corporate correction. And indeed, the moment had already begun to escape the confines of the Grandview's marble columns. Sarah Lynn, the woman who had quietly started live streaming earlier from her seat near the fireplace, continued filming, her audience growing with every passing second. Comments poured in, words of support, shock, validation, anger. "This happens every day, but never like this," one viewer typed. "She's showing us how power really looks," another wrote. Within minutes, hashtags began appearing across social media platforms. Savannah Price, Grandview Reckoning, Dignity is not optional, view counts climbed steadily. The clip of Savannah calmly addressing Jack Thompson playing on repeat as viewers shared their own stories in the comment threads. Moments of dismissal, humiliation, invisibility, now seen, now validated. Savannah did not look toward the cameras. Her focus remained firmly on the work at hand. "Jordan," she said softly, her tone businesslike but not rushed, "begin HR intake immediately for all staff on duty today. I want every employee who witnessed this to be interviewed within 72 hours. Retraining begins next week, and every policy governing front desk behavior and guest engagement will be reviewed line by line." Jordan nodded, already tapping notes into his tablet, his professionalism mirroring Savannah's own. This was not about appearances. This was about principle. David Carter, the corporate counsel, remained standing quietly nearby, a figure of calm assurance, present to ensure that every step Savannah took was grounded in policy and law. But even he, seasoned and unflappable, felt the gravity of this moment. A black woman, not demanding respect, but expecting it, enforcing it, institutionalizing it. Savannah turned her gaze briefly toward the guests gathered in the lounge, many of whom had watched the entire confrontation unfold without interruption. Her eyes met Sarah Lynn's for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of the woman's decision to document, to bear witness, to ensure this story would not be contained within these walls. Then Savannah spoke again, her voice steady, her tone unwavering but warm, almost intimate now. "For those of you recording," she said softly, her eyes sweeping the room without accusation, "don't stop. Share this if you wish. People need to see what dignity looks like, not just when it's granted, but when it's reclaimed." Her words landed with the same quiet authority as everything she had said that day, not a plea, not a performance, but a truth offered plainly and without adornment. At the front desk, Jack Thompson collected his envelope with trembling fingers, his mouth opening as if to offer a final defense, a last word to salvage pride or explain intent. But Savannah did not give him that chance. She raised one hand gently, a gesture neither dismissive nor angry, but firm and absolute. "This isn't about what you meant," she said quietly. "It's about what you did." Rachel Simmons rose from her seat, her steps slow, her face pale as she accepted her envelope without protest. She did not look Savannah in the eye, nor did she glance toward the guests, who now watched in rapt silence. As the two employees were quietly escorted away, Savannah exhaled, not in relief but in resolution. She turned once more to Jordan. "Prepare a formal statement for release this evening," she instructed calmly. "This is not an isolated incident. This is a systemic failure, and we will address it systemically. Our response begins today, not for PR but for permanence." Outside, the city moved as it always did. Taxis rushing past, footsteps hurrying along the sidewalk, lives continuing at their own pace. But inside the Grandview Hotel, the rhythm had changed. Savannah Price had not merely walked back in, she had redefined what walking back in looked like. The termination of two employees was not the end. It was only the beginning, a clear, public marker that the quiet biases so often tolerated, excused, or overlooked would now be met not with polite requests for change, but with immediate, tangible consequences. And as the lobby began slowly, almost tentatively, to return to motion, guests sipping drinks, conversations resuming, it did so with a different energy, an awareness that this space had been altered, not in architecture but in expectation. Savannah Price remained standing a moment longer, her hands folded loosely in front of her, her expression serene but resolute. The viral videos would spread, the hashtags would trend, but for her this was not about attention. It was about accountability, real, immediate, and enduring. Even as Savannah Price stood in the lobby of the Grandview Hotel, her work unfinished but her message unmistakably delivered, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble floors, stretching toward the grand entrance where Walter Price now waited quietly outside, watching through the glass. His posture was still proud, still upright, but his eyes softened as he saw his daughter standing tall, speaking with a quiet power that neither angered nor pleaded, but simply claimed what should never have been questioned: dignity. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from tense silence to reflective stillness. Staff moved more carefully, as if aware that each gesture now mattered. Guests who had first pretended not to watch now met Savannah's gaze openly, some nodding in unspoken acknowledgement, some merely observing, unsure of how to process what they had witnessed, but understanding intuitively that it mattered. Savannah allowed herself one slow breath, her hands resting lightly on the counter where, less than an hour ago, her father had stood humiliated. The symbolic symmetry of the moment was not lost on her. This was not vindication. It was restoration, a quiet correction of an old imbalance. Outside, the digital world pulsed with energy that mirrored the intensity within the Grandview's walls. Sarah Lynn's livestream continued gaining momentum, the comments filling faster than they could be read. Some viewers shared their own stories of being overlooked, ignored, dismissed for reasons unspoken but deeply felt. Others expressed astonishment that a CEO and owner had needed to return just to be seen properly. But Savannah was no longer thinking about the live stream, or about hashtags or shares or headlines. Her mind was already moving toward what would come next, the work of ensuring that today would not become just another viral moment that burned brightly and disappeared without effect. She turned toward Jordan Matthews, her voice calm but resolute. Draft a letter to the entire company, she instructed. Effective immediately, we're launching a permanent program, training, mentorship, leadership development, focused on hospitality, equity, and cultural intelligence. It won't be optional, and it won't be performative. It will change how we operate at every level. Jordan nodded without hesitation, understanding that this was more than policy, it was legacy. David Carter, standing nearby, gave Savannah a respectful nod as well, silently acknowledging that this next step would do more than correct today's failure. It would build a structure to prevent the same failure tomorrow. Savannah's gaze lifted once more to the guests in the lobby. Many of them had resumed their conversations, but an undercurrent of awareness remained, a recognition that the Grandview Hotel was no longer quite the same place it had been when they first arrived that afternoon. She stepped away from the counter, her movements unhurried, and walked slowly toward the entrance where Walter stood, his figure framed by the golden light outside. As she approached, he opened the door for her, an old-fashioned courtesy that spoke more of love than of etiquette. Savannah smiled gently as she stepped into the late summer air, warm but softened by a light breeze that carried the sounds of the city. The honk of a cab, the distant hum of voices, the rhythm of life continuing. Walter did not speak immediately. Instead, he studied his daughter's face, noting the quiet composure that had never wavered, the steady grace that had transformed humiliation into correction without a single raised voice. After a moment, he finally said, his voice low and roughened by time, "You did right today. Even if they never admit it, you did right." Savannah looked at him, a quiet smile playing at the corners of her mouth, but her eyes were serious. "I didn't do this for them, Daddy," she said softly. "I did this for us. For every time you walked into a room and they refused to see you. For every child watching now who will someday walk through these doors and know that they belong." Walter nodded slowly, emotion rising but contained in the way of men who had learned long ago how to carry pain without allowing it to define them. Together they walked toward the waiting car, the driver opening the door smoothly, respectfully, without question. Savannah paused before stepping inside, glancing back once more at the Grandview Hotel's facade, the engraved letters gleaming in the fading light. It looked the same as it always had, grand, imposing, pristine. But she knew, and everyone inside knew, that something had shifted irreversibly. As the car pulled away from the curb, Savannah leaned back in her seat, her phone buzzing quietly with messages. Board members offering support, news outlets requesting interviews, her assistant confirming the first draft of the company-wide statement. She ignored them all for the moment, turning instead to Walter. He sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze out the window as the city blurred past. "You okay?" she asked gently. Walter turned, and for a rare moment the weight he carried seemed lighter. "Better than okay," he said softly. "Proud." Savannah reached over and took his hand. Warm, weathered, steady. "This isn't the end," she murmured. "It's the beginning." And as the city lights flickered into evening, as hashtags continued to trend and comment sections filled with outrage and solidarity alike, Savannah Price knew this. True change did not happen in press releases or policy documents alone. It happened in quiet rooms and public lobbies, in the still moments where one person chose to stand, to speak, and to hold others accountable, not with noise but with unshakable grace. That was legacy, not the kind built of stone or stock portfolios, but the kind that changed the very air in a room, that rewrote what was acceptable and what would never again be tolerated. As the car disappeared into Manhattan's evening rush, Savannah held her father's hand firmly, her expression serene, but her mind already at work. This was not about winning, It was about ensuring that no one after them would have to fight the same battle again.